Welcome to BizTalk. I'm so happy to have you join us. Today's show has been taped in advance, so we will not be able to take any listener calls. And it is the 4th of July, so I hope everyone out there is being safe. I am honored to have with me here in the studio two of Metro Birmingham's brightest communication experts. Ms. Tina Tidmore, she's president of Tidmore Communications, and she's also the president of Alabama Media Professionals, a statewide organization I am planning on joining very, very soon. Welcome to BizTalk again, Tina.
Well, thank you for having me.
I had Tina on a couple months ago, and we're going to get together on every 6 to 8 weeks talking about various news media issues. I'll be having her and different media professionals. But also, I'm honored to have us with us here today, another veteran journalist that I know. I've known Wade Kwon for several years. He used to be an editor/journalist with the Birmingham Post-Herald. He's now a communications consultant who's gained a reputation as, in my opinion, Birmingham's best blogger. He's a director of the Y'all Connect social media conference. Welcome to BizTalk, Wade.
Thanks, Roy.
Wade celebrates 10 years of blogging now. I mean, that's amazing, Wade. I mean, blogging's gone a long way in 10 years, hasn't it?
It has flown by.
Well, in honor of the 4th of July holiday, celebrating our nation's freedoms, today's BizTalk is going to be focusing on one of our nation's most precious rights, freedom of the press, and how journalists' rights to know has helped educate American citizens and protect a lot of our freedoms. And it's an issue that, because of the freedom of the press, a lot of issues that politicians try to keep out of the limelight, veteran journalists like these two here are able to help protect that valuable freedom. We're also going to talk about the rise of blogging's impact, and Wade's going to weigh in on that, whether or not bloggers, as most traditional newspapers are switching to focus from print to online, whether bloggers should get the same freedom of press rights. But I'm going to have both of them introduce themselves, tell a little bit about themselves, and then we're going to go right into, I'm going to have Tina share her story. But introduce yourself briefly, and then I'm going to have you tell a little bit about your freedom of rights experiences yourself.
Well, I have a special connection to this issue of freedom of the press. When I was the editor and publisher of the Clay News newspaper from 2002 to 2009, I had what I considered to be 3 freedom of press issues I had to battle. And I consider that I was victorious in all of them. However, they were very costly and very distressing, and I did a lot of research back then on freedom of the press, and so in preparation for today, I revisited some of that research so that we could talk about the issue again, and I'd be more knowledgeable and know what has developed since then on that issue.
How long ago was it when what you were mentioning happened?
Well, it was while I was publishing the Clay News, so I would say, one of the cases didn't finish until after I closed the paper. I was sued for libel by an attorney I had written some stories on, and it ended up eventually he went to prison for some of the things that I was writing about, but in the meantime, we had this long, drawn-out lawsuit, and I had libel insurance, but I didn't check the deductible. So I ended up, for some of the legal fees, I was out $5,000 myself. And then eventually, after when he ended up having criminal charges against him, basically the lawsuit was eventually going to go away, and I closed the paper before the dismissal came from the judge. But it was happening. It happened all through. I had other issues that came up. One came in the midst of that. I was subpoenaed to reveal a source on a story I hadn't even written yet, and I had to deal with that in the midst of this other one. And then, of course, I had some dealings with the local mayor where the city had decided to publish a newsletter, which was fine, but then they started offering free ads to the businesses, and that really impeded on, the role of the press to be able to have a viable business. And so I had to deal with that issue and decide what to do about that. So those are 3 that I had to deal with back then, but these issues are still having to be fought by newspapers all over the country.
Wade, I'm going to want you to weigh in on this from the blogging perspective. Tell a little bit about yourself, and then I want you to share some of your thoughts on this freedom of the press issue.
I started out in journalism as a writer and an editor. I've moved on to doing consulting work, and I also started a blogging and social media conference here in Birmingham called Y'all Connect. So I dabble in journalism and pay attention to journalism problems and legal issues. It's interesting just because, the question I have is, can smaller media outlets survive in this litigious climate? Because freedom of the press is important, but it's also important to have deep pockets, be able to pay attorneys, to defend yourself, and to go after information and to open up meetings and so on. That's perfectly fine if you're a gigantic media conglomerate with deep pockets, but for the family-owned newspapers, for the family-owned radio stations, for the smaller guys, how do they keep up with that and still put out news and still reach out to listeners and viewers and readers if they've got to also worry about lawsuits and trying to get access to records and all the things that publishers and editors have to deal with as they're also dealing with writing, reporting, and so on?
I want you, Tina, to chime in on the topic of explaining to people a little bit about what freedom of press is. I know you've done research on that. So this is 4th of July. Talk a little bit about freedom of the press. This is our National Freedom Day.
Okay. Well, the history of asserting a freedom of press right goes back to England. And it started with book publishing. And at one time, the Pope had to give approval before something could be published. And so there started to be rebellion against that. And then it transferred to the monarchy in England, that they were licensed who was an approved publisher. And there came to be an issue that they, someone asserted that that's not good, that it's better to handle if there's a problem after the fact. And so during this time, there were colonists here in America, and there was John Hancock, who had a printing press, but his printing press was authorized government or colonial-related news from authorities. But then there was James Franklin, who is Benjamin Franklin's brother, who started an independent press. And then not long after that, Benjamin Franklin took it. Now, what's interesting, I found, is that we think of today that if somebody tells the truth, how can you be, in trouble for telling the truth, no matter what form or where? But there was actually a Sedition Act that was passed after the Revolution and after the Bill of Rights that said that if you print or say something that is harmful to the government, you can be charged with under this Sedition Act. James Madison really asserted that truth should be a defense. And there was a question as to whether, even if you told the truth, if it was harmful to the government, then you could be accused of sedition. But that ended up going by the wayside. One of the things I found very interesting was the 3 founding fathers who had a pivotal or a main role in freedom of the press. I mentioned James Madison, who really advocated more after the Bill of Rights, and he is called the father of the Bill of Rights. But also there was James Franklin, and when Benjamin Franklin took over and started doing the Pennsylvania Gazette, he started doing this two-sided reporting, or both sides, or more objective reporting, which was very unusual at the time. And it took, over 100 years for it to become standard news reporting ethics. But he got a lot of flack for that. And then there was, of course, we can't leave off Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson believed, and this is really the basis for why freedom of the press and freedom of the speech is in the Bill of Rights. They believed that the common man should use reason and know the truth, and then he could vote to determine what the government should be. So in order for the common man to exercise that power that the Founding Fathers were giving to the common man, they needed to be informed. And they believed, Thomas Jefferson believed, that if the information flows freely, that eventually the common man's reason will come to the right decision. It may not be immediately, but it would ultimately, the majority would make the best decision. So you can argue that today, but that is the foundation. So really the freedom of the press was not an individual's right to express himself. It was the public's right to have unhindered information and news so that they can then hold accountable institutions of power.
One thing I want y'all to both get into now, Wade, I want you to talk about this as well as Tina. Blogging. Whether or not these same rights, freedom of press rights, from a blogging's perspective, give me your thoughts on that. And I know Tina's researched this as well, because it looks at what role are people who do blogging, do they have the same rights as traditional journalists when it comes to freedom of the press?
Well, you'll hear me use the term blogger and journalist interchangeably, but this is my non-lawyer 2 cents, which is there are plenty of bloggers that are doing the work of journalists. There are some journalists who are acting in the capacity of bloggers. You go look at someone's work, you go look at their credentials, you go look at their background, and I defy anyone to be able to cleanly define one or the other when talking to someone, whether they've been doing it a year or 5 years or 20 years. The label becomes less and less important, at least it does to me. But, you get to the legislature here in Alabama, and they're worried about trying to define journalists versus bloggers. Who we're going to let in to cover sessions? Who are we going to let talk to legislature? And, if it were up to me, I'd let them all in. Because, as Tina pointed out, if the original intent was free flow of information, then let people in there who can bring the information to the public. It's not necessarily that one is more qualified than the other, because that always comes down to the reader or the listener or the audience member. They're the ones who assign credibility. They're the ones who assign, whether or not this person knows what they're talking about. So I have no problem with new media, and new is a relative term, new media coming into these traditional forums and having the equal opportunity to report, to pontificate, to write opinions on, to talk about. I mean, we see this all the time. We see it on talk radio. We see it in newspapers. We see it in magazines, in essays and columns. We see it on television on a regular basis. Cable news makes its bones on it. So this is not anything new to the American media landscape, but those who are elected, those who are captains of industry, sometimes they don't necessarily want all of those prying eyes. They don't want to be investigated. They don't want to be looked at too closely. And so they tend to be the ones who put their thumbs down to, opening up to a wider world of bloggers, reporters, those who are new to it, those who've been around a while, and so on, those who have audiences that are non-traditional audiences. I mean, there are plenty of people who are making their living, sending videos to YouTube. They might be doing it for entertainment value. They may be doing it for shock value. They may be doing it to share news, to share opinions, to share their cause. But that is a non-traditional audience. We tend to measure audience in how many thousands or millions of people watch a TV program. But people measure how many views a video gets. They measure how many subscribers a YouTube publisher has. So the world is wide open to it. People obviously pay attention to videos on YouTube and things that their friends share in blogs and on Facebook and on Twitter. But I think it's harder for some of us who have been in journalism a while to embrace a lot of these crazy changes.
Tina, I want your thoughts about this issue as well. I mean, what do you think?
Well, I think there's really two things here. The question of, as a blogger, somebody who does videos on YouTube, should they have the status of reporter or journalist? But before you decide that, you need to know, well, what is this status or rights of a journalist? And first of all, as I said, the freedom of the press was an individual freedom to speak in a printed word. You could print up a flyer and distribute it. You could do a booklet. You could do a book. All of that was freedom of the press. It wasn't just for newspapers. And so what happened is there was a pivotal court case that went all the way to the Alabama Supreme Court. And it is Sullivan versus New York Times. And this actually started in Alabama. So it's, as far as freedom of the press goes, Alabama has a central role in its history.
I did not know that.
Yeah. This is in the Civil Rights era. And what happened is there was a group who ran an ad. It wasn't an article. They ran an ad in the New York Times asking for money to help with Martin Luther King's defense fund. And they put in some information in the ad that had some inaccuracies on details. And in the ad listed the governor, it listed another government official of the state, and then it also listed some actions of the Montgomery Police Department. Now, some of those, like, how many have been arrested, the number was not quite right. And so a lawsuit. Well, first a request for retraction was made, and the New York Times position was, we didn't mention the police chief of Montgomery. We don't see what your issue is. And so he sued, and it went all the way to the Supreme Court. And that is the first time that I have seen a record where there is a distinction made in what freedom of the press means for a reporter and what it means for the public. Now, in this atmosphere, there were a lot of newspapers who were afraid to print about the civil rights issue because if they made a mistake, even in their news report, if they made a mistake, they'd end up sued, and many were being sued by...
I wanted to bring this up too. I've also heard stories about a lot of papers were afraid to talk about this issue because at the time, Bull Connor and people like that were running things, and they may get attacked by the Klans. You know what I'm trying to say?
Yeah, that may be, but on the legal side, even across the country, like I said, this was New York Times, and it was an ad, it was an article, but they were sued. And the Supreme Court decided then that in order for a libel claim against a newspaper for a newspaper to be held accountable for libel, the person bringing the claim had to prove that the reporting agency or news agency had actual malice. Couldn't be they just made a mistake. And so reporters were given this little leeway where they could report and do their job because up to that time, many of them had been doing what we call self-censoring. They would refuse to report because even if they made a mistake, they could end up being sued for libel. Well, you still can be sued for libel, but you can't win against a reporter unless you can show that reporter had malice or complete recklessness towards even trying to find out the truth. So this set a little bit of a different standard for reporters. So then the question is, does that apply to bloggers? Even a newspaper that does their news on the web, it's something that's not in the newspaper. Well, it ended up that ended up being broadened to broadcast and radio, the protections there. There is a recent lawsuit that actually goes direct to that issue. And it was decided in the Ninth Circuit Court. It's not made it up to the Supreme Court, so we don't know if they may, if it's going to be appealed. I don't know if it's been appealed. But it said, this is an Oregon reporter in the Ninth Circuit Court said that the blogger has the same rights as a reporter. What they said is that the act of reporting does not depend on whether the person has a journalism degree, is associated with some news industry, follows any kind of ethics that has become commonplace. It has more to do with, is the person of the story a public figure? Is the matter being reported a matter of public concern? And then, therefore, the person that is distributing news or information or opinion about that could rightly be called a reporter. And therefore, if there's a libel claim, it would have to be actual malice against them.
Wade, I want your thoughts about that. That's fascinating news. What do you think about that?
Well, let me caution any bloggers out there who are looking upon journalism as something to be vaunted or to aspire to, because I've worked with a lot of them. Tina's worked with them. Roy's worked with a lot of them. And maybe because we've worked in that industry, we tend to think higher of journalists, but the public does not think very well of journalists. So bloggers who want journalism status are going to get everything associated with it. Journalists get thrown in jail on a regular basis for following the law, for protecting their sources. Journalists have been killed and injured around the world. Journalists smell. They are dirty. They will do anything for a story, and not everyone is qualified to tell a story. I've worked with some very fine journalists in my day, but I've also worked with a few that I'm surprised they made it into a newsroom anywhere. So bloggers that aspire to journalist status, I mean, there may be a few perks, but there's also a huge downside to all of it. And you know, that might be a reason why there are fewer and fewer journalists left. It's not only because the industry is shrinking, but you can only deal with so much. You can only put up with so much. But bloggers understand that it may take more than just one email to get a story. They may understand that to reach people, they've got to tell the story over and over again, and they've got to find new angles on it, and they've got to bring in fresh ways of telling the story. And I think that's where you get to the exciting part is they're not necessarily bound by traditional training. They're not necessarily bound by traditional rules. Sometimes that's good, sometimes that's bad. But their perspective, their energy, their creativity, that's the exciting thing to watch. And that's where you start to see movement on some issues that you may not see in traditional media. And so finding those bloggers and giving them an opportunity to tell their stories, I think that's what matters the most.
For those who are just tuning in, I have on the air with me Mr. Wade Kwon, who's a local blogger, and he has the Y'all Connect social media conference, and also Tina Tidmore, who is the president of the Alabama Media Professionals. Before we go on to this next question, for those who are listening in, tell about how they can reach you, and then we're going to share that information also at the end of the show.
For me, you can get me at the Alabama Media Professionals website, alabamamediaprofessionals.com. There's a Contact Our Leadership tab, and so that's where you can find my information.
I'm blogging every week on y'allconnect.com, so that's y'allconnect.com.
Spell it for me.
YALLCONNECT.com. And you can also find me on Twitter at WadeOnTweets, WadeOnTweets.
I want Tina to talk about some other court cases related to this freedom of the press issue.
Okay, if I may, I'd like to comment on what Wade had said about blogging. One of the things I've noticed at the last two conferences I went to, yours and then one hosted by the American Marketing Association, was that I noticed a lot of public relations people are now talking about submitting story ideas to bloggers. So now public relations people are now treating bloggers as reporters. So, the question has to be the access that is sometimes granted to reporters because, the government officials are trying to get a message out. Should that be opened up to bloggers? And, can anybody claim to be a blogger? And so those issues have to be settled. But just remembering that it is, freedom of the press is the person's right. These decisions that go back, way back in 1931, there was a Supreme Court decision that said that in almost all instances, prior restraint on any reporting would be a violation of freedom of the press. Now, again, that might include a flyer, a booklet, a book, not just the newspapers. So one thing that's a little different that came up in some of the court cases is if you have a libel case, which is commonly what newspapers have to deal with, and other news media, is who has the burden of proving whether the fact was true and untrue. And libel is a civil case, and so the person bringing the case usually has to make the proof. Well, in that case, if someone says, I am a victim of libel, therefore I'm going to bring a lawsuit, then you have to prove that what the person published, is untrue. And it's not on the burden of the news media to prove it is true. Now, that's a little bit of a twist from what is happening in Europe. The 1972 case said that reporters' freedom of press does not include protecting anonymous sources. Now, this is a federal case. It did say that any government that has a legitimate reason to find out a source needs to pursue all other avenues for discovering that source rather than subpoenaing the reporter. So, but a reporter can be subpoenaed to reveal a source.
Listen, it's time to take a break, but it's been a fascinating discussion so far. Hard to believe we've been on air 25 minutes already. So we're going to take a break, and we'll be back after this. And after we come back, we're going to continue discussion about freedom of the press, as well as I'm going to have Wade share information on what he considers to be, in addition to his own blog, his favorite blogs. We'll be back after this. Fascinating discussion so far. I wanted Tina now to chime in. I want Tina to chime in on the topic of the Alabama Shield Law. Is that what it's called?
Yes,
Reporter Shield Law.
Yes.
And I want Wade to chime in as well as on whether or not it applies to bloggers. Tell everybody what the Alabama Reporter Shield Law is.
Okay. Back in 1935, according to the research I have done, there was a law that said that newspaper reporters cannot be forced to reveal a source in Alabama. Now, we had just spoken about the federal courts had said that a reporter can be forced to reveal a source, but Alabama has this state law that applies in the state that they cannot be forced. However, it specifically says newspaper, radio broadcasting station, or television station, while engaged in news gathering activity, cannot be forced to reveal a source. Now, there was a case that came up in 2005 where Sports Illustrated did a story on a coach and his activities with some women, and he was sued for libel. The Sports Illustrated was sued for libel for that report, and the burden was on the person claiming that it was untrue to prove it was untrue. Well, how are you going to prove it untrue? Go find the sources of that reporter. So they subpoenaed for the reporter to reveal the sources, and he did not. And it went on up into federal court, but the federal court said that the Alabama Shield Law did not apply to magazines because it didn't list magazines. But they said the practice and a previous federal court decision had said that even if you go by the freedom of the press, that previous federal court decisions say that any government or any subpoena to try to get a reporter source, that individual or group need to find every other opportunity and pursue every other opportunity to find out the source or to find out the information without subpoenaing. It should be a last resort, is basically what the federal decisions, and that's what they decided in that case. And the person who claimed to be wrong had not pursued all the others. So even though they didn't get that Alabama Shield Law protection because it was determined they were a magazine and the law didn't specifically say magazine, there was this secondary protection, which is not absolute. The Alabama Shield Law is absolute in the cases that it's mentioned. Now, it doesn't say anything about websites, blogging. So it would be interesting to see if a case came up, how a federal court would, or the state courts or federal court would decide. They've got a precedent here that says, no, the law didn't say magazine, so it doesn't apply.
Wade, you're a blogger. Give me your thoughts about the shield law, and do you think it also should apply to bloggers?
In working as a reporter and an editor for a long time, I've had the good fortune to work with attorneys about these issues before and after they come up. I mean, this is part of the routine of working at a media outlet. And I was lucky that in college I got to study communication law. That is no substitute for a law degree, but it at least gave me some grounding and understanding what the rules are, and at least be able to form the proper questions to ask an attorney. If you're a blogger, you might be in over your head, especially if you haven't had formal journalism training. And so one of the things that I always tell bloggers is make sure that as you ramp up your blog, especially if you're doing it as a business venture, have an attorney, talk to an attorney, use an attorney, because they are the ones who keep you out of jeopardy and help you when you get a cease and desist letter or face a lawsuit or any number of problems that can come up. Keith Lee, who is one of the top law bloggers, is an attorney here in Birmingham, and he speaks to blogging groups on a regular basis, and he outlines all potential pitfalls. So one, of course, is having potentially to reveal your sources. Another are libel and slander and defamation suits or invasion of privacy. But there's also problems with copyright and intellectual property. And what if someone, hacks your website, or what if someone leaves a potentially libelous comment in the comment section, or what if you have to deal with payment issues and other things that, as a publisher, as a blogger, as a reporter, you might not know the answers to. And so the best thing to do is to make sure that you have an attorney in your corner, because it's very hard to predict where your blogging might take you. And it's also hard to predict what pitfalls you might run into. But a knowledgeable attorney is going to steer you away from 99.9% of those things. That doesn't mean you're not going to face issues, but it's foolish for a blogger to face them without a competent attorney in their corner.
Do y'all have any bloggers that are as part of your organization, Tina?
Oh, yes, definitely.
Talk about some of the other cases that you've researched.
Well, first, there's one thing that was kind of interesting, that as Wade is talking about needing to be informed before you venture out into distributing information freely. It's completely different when you're sitting, in a restaurant and, gossiping with your girlfriend than it is when you go to put it out on whatever, Facebook or as a blog or things like that. There's a certain amount of responsibility that reporters have been trained or experienced through or told by their editors to be concerned about, or the editors watch for. So if you're a blogger, you are your own editor, so you need to know about these things. A lot of people think freedom of speech just means I can say and do anything, or freedom of press means I can print or publish anything. But there has always been limitations on this freedom of the press. For example...
before you get into that, you said something I think is fascinating.
Okay.
So many people say things on Facebook or Twitter that can sometimes be considered libel.
Yeah, it could be, but there's a recent case on that. Well, not on libel, but on a man who was threatening on his Facebook page, threatening his wife. And this is a recent Supreme Court ruling, and they determined that his rantings and threats were not what he actually intended, so it was protected by freedom of the press or freedom of speech. That if he actually did intend to do immediate harm, and his threats were real, so they determined it didn't matter what the wife felt or the public felt or a reasonable person. They determined, and it was a court case just in the last month from the Supreme Court, they decided it had to do with his intent. So Facebook is now getting up to the Supreme Court. So people, not only bloggers, but people who post on Facebook need to know that they may end up in these cases. But the things that have not been allowed, I just mentioned what would be called fighting words when it is intended to create an immediate violent reaction. That is not allowed under freedom of the press. Obscenity, pornography is, but not obscenity. Child pornography, you can't, harass people. You can't commit fraud. All of these libel laws, copyright laws, all of these things are regulations on what you can print, what you can publish. So freedom of the press has not ever been absolute. Of course, it's intended to be a free flow of information to empower the public. And so that's where a lot of people are confused. Like Wade said, we kind of get this either if we're trained in college as a journalist or if we are working for a news media, we have to deal with these issues. We learn these, how to do this responsibly and stay within the law. But many people, the public in general, not having to deal with these issues, need to know before they just launch out and start printing something. You mentioned something that is an interesting issue that's come up recently, and that is if you have a blog or discussion forums, who is responsible if there's libelous comment on there from a third party? And there's been a couple of court cases where somebody sued, and then the company said, no, we're distributors. We're not publishers. So we're just like the guy who's got the newspaper stand, and somebody else is actually doing the publishing. We just hold a place for them to pick it up or see it. And
Wade, what do you think about that? That's fascinating what you mentioned.
Tina's spot on. It's my understanding is that if someone does something potentially libelous on your comment section, the publisher, the blogger, is not responsible. Now, that doesn't mean that the blogger can't step in and moderate the comment. I've done that on multiple occasions. But, there has to be a reasonable limit. Bloggers can't police every single comment that's out there, nor can they verify every single crazy claim that someone happens to wander by and leave on your site. So it appears on the face of it to be something that is in favor of bloggers.
Tina, talk about some of the other cases that you researched.
Okay, well, there's a concern about Twitter. Twitter has claimed to be a distributor, which means it just flows freely. We just hold it. We don't.
Is that the same thing Facebook says?
No.
Facebook's a little different.
Well, yeah. Yes, that is true. But now that there's been a couple of times that Twitter has removed people's accounts and people have, or removed tweets or things, if you use some sort of moderation of what the content is, then you can be declared a publisher, and therefore you are responsible for what you allow because you're using some of your judgment. Now, if you're a distributor and you say, no, we don't do any kind of governing, it's a free-for-all, we don't get involved in it, then you can claim that you are not a publisher and therefore not responsible, just like telephone companies not responsible for what's said over telephone lines.
I'm curious to get y'all's perspective on Facebook and a person's personal Facebook page or Twitter page or Instagram, etc. If they use it as a vehicle to talk about various issues, could they be considered, could they have protections for some of the things they say?
Well, I'll put on my fake lawyer hat and just say that there are consequences to freedom of the press and free speech. And
I've heard people got fired for some of the things they say on Facebook or Twitter or whatever.
People tend to forget that. They think free speech, as Tina pointed out, is a free-for-all. And we have wonderful platforms to get the word out. It used to be you have to go walk to the town square, stand on a literal soapbox, and shout to passersby. But now we have devices and we have tools and we have technology to allow us to reach millions or billions of people around the world. But with that power comes responsibility for what you say and the consequences that come out of it. I think a common charge is censorship, and there's such a great misunderstanding of the word. Censorship is if the government comes in and shuts you down for whatever reason. As far as I know, in the United States, there haven't been too many cases of censorship at the federal or the state or the local level. But there are consequences, as you all have pointed out. You could lose your job. You could be, people could yell back at you. You could be ostracized within your community and so on. I want to come at it from a different approach. Is with whatever you use, whether it's Facebook or Twitter or your blog, it's Independence Day, and the one thing that I like to push bloggers to do is actually use their voice, to put their heart and soul out there, because it matters. I want to hear from real people about real things, and I think we are timid. I think we're concerned about what people might think. We're concerned about the consequences or so on. I'd be lying if I didn't say that reporters did get nervous before publishing a big controversial story. But they publish it because they think someone out there is going to be interested. They think it matters. And what I'm here to say to other bloggers is your voice matters too. And freedom of the press, freedom of speech, these are rights we should exercise on a regular basis to the fullest extent that we can.
What do y'all see as some of the most common current threats to the freedom of the press?
Well, listening to reporters' phone lines or keeping up with who reporters are talking about. This is going on a federal level. Some individual cases, of course. There's been some where there's a secret subpoena to Google for a reporter's Gmail account to be monitored. This is by the Department of Justice. That's a threat. That certainly is a threat. Internationally, there's getting to be a growing lack of respect for reporters, so that now it's more common for reporters to be kidnapped, to be killed, to be brought up on charges, so that special immunity that reporters had because it was seen by both sides of most issues that they were objective and not involved in the conflict, that's waning, and so we see more attacks. There's been prosecutions of whistleblowers. Eric Snowden is a prime example. And if whistleblowers can't, speak to the press, which there are some laws, there's some security, restrictions, but if they see injustice or wrongdoing and they end up being prosecuted for, that's a threat to the press being able to do their job. And then very likely press, since there is no federal reporter shield law, they would be subpoenaed to reveal their source on things and end up having to expose a whistleblower, go to jail, as many reporters do. And I was speaking to an attorney recently about this, and he said people are having a hard time understanding that when they put something out on Facebook or Twitter, and then the news reports on it, then they get upset that the news reported on what they themselves put out.
I've seen that. Look, as a journalist, I've done it before. You go into, say a person gets in the news, you go check out what they said on Facebook. The guy who killed the people in Charleston, that's how, the Confederate flag issue got in the news, because there were pictures on his Facebook page of him with the Confederate flag. So some people may think that's not fair for a reporter to go to my Facebook page, what have you, and take stuff off and use it in a story. But when they put it out there on Facebook or Twitter, it becomes kind of public, doesn't it?
Yeah, and then he said that there's been some real concern about people not understanding that, and then news media carrying the information that they themselves put out to the public. I mean, but it used to happen. I've been in a public meeting with over 40 people in a room, and they're discussing some subject, and some lady would stand up, "Now, what I'm about to say, Tina, don't you put in that paper." And I'm like,
you're at a public meeting. I'm sorry.
Public meeting, And of course, as a reporter, I can't stand up and get in an argument with her there in the meeting.
Well, that gets into the area of freedom of press versus freedom of speech. Give me y'all's thoughts as reporters on that, the difference with that.
I don't know that there is a difference. To me, freedom of the press is a speech in a typed form. That's what I think of as freedom of the press. Now, it's ended up including broadcast and other things, but I've always, in some of the, to be specific in what has been said as what is freedom of the press, in one of the court cases, one of the justices says it applies to anyone and any vehicle of information or opinion. So the vehicle would be the means by which it is transmitted to another person. Mm-hmm. So he said that would apply to, that is what freedom of the press is. It's to anyone. Now, one of the things that I think is interesting, a lot of people don't realize, is that the right is the publisher's right, because as we spoke, it is the publisher's responsibility mm-hmm. for what they put out. So you can't send a comment to the newspaper and demand that they put in your comment mm-hmm. because you have the right of freedom of the press. Yeah. No, it is the newspaper, which is the publisher, mm-hmm. that carries that right. So if Facebook is a publisher, then they would have the right to do whatever they want with mm-hmm. your comments. Mm-hmm. You know, take it down, remove it, do whatever. Mm-hmm. They are the publisher, and because they hold responsibility. If they are not a publisher, then they would not have any responsibility and not have the rights either. So right. It's kind of, you know, a lot of people don't realize when they get on Facebook and they'll comment on somebody deletes their comment, they say, wait a minute, what about freedom of mm-hmm. speech? No, that's you can go page. Set up your own blog. You can go set up your own page or whatever. That's where you can exercise, and you become the publisher then. Mm-hmm. You can go print up some flyers and hand them out. Then you are the publisher, and you have that freedom of press, and you have that freedom of speech.
Wade, I want you to weigh in on that freedom of press versus free speech.
Well, that's why we're seeing the blurring of lines because of technology. I mean, literally everyone has access to publishing around the world, and you know, it used to be you have to have a printing press. Well, very, very, very few people in the world at one point had access to a printing press. Mm-hmm. Now everyone, millions, billions of people have access to mobile phone technology. Mm-hmm. And with that technology, you can access Facebook, you can access Twitter, you can access Instagram. That's why you see a photo of a United Airlines plane making an emergency landing on the Hudson River, mm-hmm. not coming from local news media, but coming from a ferry passenger who happens to be passing by at that exact moment.
Or the big issue today is someone happens to have a camera and catches a police officer, you know, unfortunately doing something that he should not do.
And we've even got the term citizen journalist.
Yeah, that's a good point. Anybody who has an iPhone, you know, basically can be considered a citizen journalist.
And that's where we run into the challenges. To your earlier question about the threats to freedom of the press, I see a couple of things. One is the lack of a national shield law to protect reporters nationwide from revealing their sources. Tina mentioned the fact that mm-hmm. whistleblowers are at risk. Well, journalists are at risk too, and mm-hmm. they can either do their job and go to jail, or they can give up their source, lose all credibility, and lose their job anyway.
I have a quick question for you. Sure. As someone who's trying to get into blogging. WordPress, Blogger, what's the best platform in your opinion?
Well, I encourage bloggers to try out all the platforms because they're free, and I happen to be a WordPress fan, but many people do very great blogs, exciting blogs on Blogger and Squarespace and other platforms. So the thing that I tell them is go try them out because it doesn't cost you anything. Use the one that you like the best because if you're fighting with your blogging platform, you're never going to blog.
Gotcha. Listen, we got about 3 minutes left. How people can reach you, and then I'm going to have her close out with at least one last case, but remind people again how they can reach you.
Well, they can reach me at yallconnect.com. That's YALLCONNECT.com. We've got videos and stories and ideas on blogging and social media, and they can reach me on Twitter at WadeOnTweets.
Tina?
You can find me at the Alabama Media Professionals website, which is alabamamediaprofessionals.com. And I will mention that next week we are having a meeting on Thursday at the Homewood Library.
Yeah, the exact date that is.
That is
because July the 9th.
Thursday after July 4th.
Yeah, that's July the 9th.
Today, so
Thursday, July the 9th.
Yeah, there you go. And it's about, we're going to be sharing with each other what our skill set, because we end up referring work to each other a lot of times. And so we're going to do a skill swap at that meeting where we've gotten a lot of new members, and we're going to share with each other.
I definitely need to go to that because I need to join.
Yeah. And So that's how you can find me, and the information is there under the contact our leadership.
Gotcha. Let's talk one last case before we have to get ready to go.
Well, there was, as I said, there was that Facebook case, but there was another interesting case just here in the last month that came from the Supreme Court, and it had to do with sign ordinances. We don't realize, again, there are some restrictions in speech. You can't put a big sign everywhere and anywhere. So there are some restrictions as far as signs. And what the Supreme Court decided is that there was a town that had a different restriction for political signs than it had for directional signs for an event. The political signs could be bigger and stay up longer. The directional signs could not. They had to be shorter and stay up on a certain. The Supreme Court said you cannot regulate signs based on the content.
Wow.
So that was a pivotal decision that came down. Another one is, a lot of people don't understand, high school newspapers do not have the rights of free press because the school is the publisher. The publisher has the right to determine the content. Now, many allow a lot of freedom and comment. And
does that apply to college newspapers as well?
Whoever is the publisher has the right, so I wouldn't know. If it's independent, then no. It would be whatever owns the structure that is doing the publishing. But if it is the school, if it's a school-sponsored and the teacher does it and all that kind of stuff, then they don't have the same freedom of press because the publisher is the school. So they have the right to decide the content. So that's another decision that happened in the past.
Well, listen, it's hard to believe, but we've been here for 55 minutes, which our time is about up, but this is such a fascinating conversation. We're going to have to continue it again. But thank you all for joining me, and I just hope you both have a great 4th of July. And, again, I look forward to having you back on again. And Tina and I are going to be getting together on a regular basis to get some other media professors in. We want to keep this topic going because there's a lot of issues out there. But thank you all for joining me today on BizTalk. And, again, y'all have a great holiday. And for those of you out there, if you are firing fireworks tonight, please be careful. I know I will be with my kids. And I hope you guys have a great holiday weekend. Both of you, thank you for joining me. Any closing remarks before we go?
No, thank you for having me. And I'm glad to see some discussion about media issues happening here. I'd like to start getting more into the local media issues as we go forward.
Yes, definitely. Wade?
Thanks, Roy. Everyone have a great Independence Day.
All right, thank y'all. And if you would like to be considered as a guest on BizTalk or an ad partner, call me at 205-572-1359 or email me at BizTalkWithRoy@gmail.com. Have a great 4th of July, everybody.
No representation is made that the quality of the legal services to be performed is greater than the quality of the legal services performed by other lawyers. The hiring